So what do you get when you have a movie that's basically the same thing as another movie that was released a year prior, and one that was overshadowed by a much bigger movie with a kind of similar premise that was released within the same year? Well, mateys, you get Vice Versa, and we're going to talk about it today. You're on Captain Adam's VHS pirate ship, and this is Captain's Corner. Sit back and relax and have a good time. You'll learn a few things on Captain's Corner. It's Captain's Corner.
Captain's Corner.
Film reviews and home video history. Today's topic, Vice Versa. Released in theaters March 11th, 1988, Vice Versa would go on to be a largely forgotten about film. At least for the most part, anyway. You ask your average Joe Blow on the street what Vice Versa is, and they're not gonna know. Vice Versa, is that some kind of salve? Good guess, but no, it isn't. It's a film that should be on everyone's top 10 list of really groovy 80s movies. Because it is. It's a great film, and one that does not get nearly enough attention. I mean, hey, it's got Judge Reinhold in it, and that is what you call a recipe for a great 80s movie. Vice Versa would seemingly become a relatively forgotten about movie, but initially, this was not the case. It enjoyed mild success at the box office, raking in almost $14 million to counter a $10 million budget. And for a short time after that, its VHS would continue to rake in profits from video rentals. But after this honeymoon was over, it sort of just drifted away into obscurity. But why is that? Why was this movie initially successful, but then would just be forgotten about? When it really should not be forgotten about because it's a great movie. Well, my theory is that this film's release was sandwiched between two other films that had similar premises. And these premises included a child being thrust forth into adulthood via mystical circumstances, which is a totally fantastical concept which somehow has great comedic value. But just like jokes about pizza, Chinese food, or childbirth, it's all in the delivery, and the same is true for comedy movies. Meaning that a comical concept doesn't always work if you don't do it well. Which brings us to a movie that is basically the same thing as Vice Versa, Like Father, Like Son, which was released in theaters October 2nd, 1987. And the premise of Vice Versa is basically the same thing as this film, but with different circumstances. And hey, Like Father, Like Son has Kirk Cameron, so there's that. So these two movies are basically the same thing, and the critics certainly noticed that. However, they did not hold this against Vice Versa, because Vice Versa is a superior film. Roger Ebert said it best by stating, "Who would have predicted that the plot of one of last year's worst movies could produce one of this year's most enduring comedies?" And he had a great point, and it's all proof that it's all in the delivery, and that great actors can make anything palatable. Vice Versa, of course, stars Judge Reinhold and Fred Savage. Like Father, Like Son stars Dudley Moore and Kirk Cameron. And for whatever reason, the latter pairing just did not work. Maybe, just maybe, it was that Kirk Cameron was better on television than he was on film. And I don't know why that makes sense, because it shouldn't, but it does. Everyone was cool with him on Growing Pains, but seeing him on the big screen was a bridge too far. Even though Like Father, Like Son was a stinker, it did rather well at the box office, better than Vice Versa did. It took in $34 million to counter a $10.5 million budget. But of course, box office numbers do not necessarily mean that the film was good, because the audience already pays their money, and by the time they realize they're watching shit, it's too late. So the box office figures would prove that the audience was ready for a movie about mystical body switching. But the critical response would say that they did not want such a movie with Dudley Moore and Kirk Cameron. Well, how about one with Judge Reinhold and Fred Savage? Maybe that would work. And it did. And the world found out just a few months after the release of Like Father, Like Son. And even though its box office numbers weren't as good as Like Father, Like Son, Vice Versa would prove to be more enjoyable, because it was just done extremely well. But still, there's no disguising the fact that Vice Versa is basically a ripoff of Like Father, Like Son. The screenplays and the concepts and the premises of these two films were so similar that it could not help but be noticed, and it has been described as a rare Hollywood coincidence. And I don't buy that at all. There was certainly some espionage going on, because this is covert idea stealing at its best. But like I said, no one seems to mind that Vice Versa was a ripoff, and if the ripoff is better than what it's ripping off, then it doesn't matter. So Like Father, Like Son would be one of the bookends that would add to Vice Versa's relative obscurity, because the plots were so similar that both films would sort of just drift away from memory. The other bookend would be Big, which was released in theaters June 3rd, 1988, only a few months after the release of Vice Versa. And even though these two films are very different, people just could not help but compare them, because the premise is a little similar. And once again, we have a child being thrust forth into adulthood via mystical circumstances. But that's really where the similarities end, and Vice Versa, of course, has the added aspect of an adult being pushed back into childhood, once again via mystical circumstances. And Big does not have that, however, it was still similar enough to make everyone forget about Vice Versa. And that is because Big was a huge movie, excuse the pun. It was massively successful. It was made on a budget of $18 million and took in $151 million at the box office. Big totally overshadowed Vice Versa, and most people's knowledge of Vice Versa sort of just faded away. And though it had a mildly successful afterlife on VHS because of rentals, this is more than likely because people would rent Vice Versa because Big had already been rented out. Gotta pick something. And one thing that would certainly add to most people's lack of recollection when it came to Vice Versa is the fact that it was only released on North American VHS once, which, believe it or not, is strange because when you have a movie that was made by a major studio, like Vice Versa was, that movie would have at least one more VHS distribution sometime in the 90s. The 90s is when VHS production was at its cheapest, and many major studios would re-release their titles in an effort to make more money. And because of that cheap production, the price point would be low enough to focus more on retail sales as opposed to rentals. So given all that, it is weird that Vice Versa was not re-released in the 90s. Instead, it only got one US VHS release, which was its initial distribution in 1988 by RCA Columbia Home Video. This movie is so glanced over when it really shouldn't be. It's forgotten about when shit like Pretty in Pink is considered great. Vice Versa is a pretty damn good movie. It's delightful and well done, and it's just fun. Judge Reinhold really shows off his acting chops in this, and does a great job portraying an 11-year-old boy, which is a lot of fun because he just acts like he has brain damage, which if you think about it, that's what kids are like. He's totally convincing and perfect for this lead role. And Fred Savage, man, I've never been able to stand that guy. Does an excellent job portraying an uptight adult. I don't know what it is, I just never liked him. Maybe it's because it seems like his cheeks get in the way when he talks. I don't know what it is, but this movie really turned me around on him. And it could be said that I am now a Fred Savage fan. He just does a very great job in this film, and it's particularly funny to watch him holding martinis, which you see a lot. I don't know why watching little kids drinking martinis is funny, but it is. And the supporting cast is pretty great as well. Yep, this film also stars the great David Provel and Swoosie Kurtz. They portray the villains in this film, and villains is in quotations because, well, they're not really villains. Sure, they kind of do villainous things, and obviously you're supposed to view them as the villains, but it's a little hard to. They're just international goods smugglers that want their mystical skull back. This film also briefly features James Hong, who is best known for portraying Lo Pan in Big Trouble in Little China. Beverly Archer has a small role in this, and at this point in time, you really hadn't seen anything out of her since Mama's Family. This film also features a very young Ajay Naidu, and forgive me if I butchered that name. And of course, he's best known from his role in the film Office Space. This film also briefly features Christian Fitzpatrick in a bit part. Who's he? Well, you know, he's the kid that played Joe in Santa Claus the movie. I mean, come on, when's the last time you saw him in anything? And in a brief yet highly important part in this movie, we have Harry Yorku. And he's best known from the film Summer Rental for his portrayal of the character Yorku. Oh, wait, that's actually his name? Huh. Vice Versa is full of surprises, and for all you metalheads out there, you'll be happy to know that this film also features Malice, which I had thought was just a fictitious band they made up for this movie, but it turns out they're a real band, and they were signed to Metal Blade Records. Vice Versa is a totally fun movie, and totally underrated. In fact, you could say it's funderrated. So yeah, Vice Versa, being a funderrated movie, certainly deserves your attention. If you haven't seen it, see it. If you have seen it, watch it again. And you know what? In all fairness, you really should give Like Father, Like Son a chance. It's not exactly funderrated, but it might be worth your time. And though these similarities between Vice Versa and Like Father, Like Son are pretty obvious, there are some differences. I mean, not many, but the big one being the body-switching circumstances. And Like Father, Like Son, it's more science-y than it is mystical, but there is still some mysticism about it. I can't guarantee you won't be disappointed with Like Father, Like Son, but I can guarantee you will have a pretty good time watching Vice Versa. Well, that's going to wrap it up. Thank you very much for watching this edition of Captain's Corner. Take care out there and keep it locked right here, only on Captain Adam's VHS Pirate Ship Retro Reviews.